Well, there's a book and a movie that I just love, and not many people have seen it. It's called To End All Wars. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It basically recounts the experiences of a man named Ernest Gordon. Ernest Gordon, he was from Scotland, and he was a British officer during World War II. And after his capture, he was one of the troops that was in Singapore when Japan attacked and besieged Singapore. And after his army unit surrendered there, he spent 3 years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp in Burma, in the jungles of Burma, where he, along with up to 250 other Allied prisoners, were subjected to forced labor during the construction of the Burmese Railroad near the River Kwai. If you've ever seen the movie The Bridge Over the River Kwai, this is where Ernest Gordon was also held prisoner, and they worked on that railroad as well. Now, the Japanese, they didn't uphold the Geneva Convention or anything like that, and they were especially cruel to prisoners. And, man, the death rate in these prisoner of war camps in Burma were so high. And basically, if you were there, the odds were you probably weren't going to make it out alive. And Gordon, at the time, he was an agnostic. And as he suffered all that he did in those prisoner of war camps, he grew in his hatred, not only for the Japanese, but also his hatred for God, as he watched those around him subjected to torture and inhumane conditions. And it so weakened him that he eventually ends up in what's called the death ward. He's sick, he's exhausted, he's on the verge of starvation. And when you're put in this tent called the death ward, basically that's designated for those who aren't going to survive. So you come in, but you never leave. And he's put into that death ward, basically. But it was here that, through the selfless care of a fellow prisoner, that Ernest Gordon came to faith in Jesus. And his entire outlook changes. In fact, he miraculously recovers. He's one of the few that ever left that tent and made a full recovery. And even though Ernest and his fellow prisoners were worked tirelessly, they were tortured, they were starved, he and his fellow Christian POWs began to bless the guards rather than curse them, to forgive, to show forgiveness and love rather than hatred and revenge. In fact, many more prisoners as a result of this came to new life in Jesus through his work. And while the outward conditions in those prisoner of war camps never changed, they never improved, the lives of these POWs were transformed as their attitudes were changed. In fact, Ernest Gordon even says himself, in the midst of captivity, we found purpose and freedom. Now, what's interesting about this whole story, and I'm a big history buff, so I love stories like this, but while Ernest Gordon, he couldn't control what happened to him once he was made a prisoner, he could control his attitude. And that made all the difference. You know, speaking of attitude, there was another person in World War II. This was actually a man named Viktor Frankl, who was a concentration camp survivor. So he went through amazing hardship as well. And he says this. He says, everything can be taken from a man but one thing: to choose one's attitude in any given circumstances, to choose one's way. Attitude means everything. You know, as followers of Jesus, this is a game changer. I mean, in our world today, think of all that we endure that's out of our control. Think of all in this past year we've seen and we've experienced that we had no control over happening. I mean, think of some of these things. Injustice that we see. Financial loss that's through no fault of our own. Traffic everywhere we go. Health issues that come out of nowhere. Even weather phenomenon that can kind of upend our lives have happened. And then we face hatred and discrimination for our faith, for our skin color, nationality, our political views, and we see this going on. And it's all really through us just living our lives and nothing necessarily that we did. But we can't control what happens. And all of this, it can cause a lot of stress in our lives, can it? And it can lead us to get angry and sometimes even act out in ways that don't reflect Jesus in our world. And while much of what happens to us we can't control or change, we can always choose how we respond. We can always choose our attitudes. In fact, there's some attitudes that we can develop as followers of Jesus that make all the difference when it comes to us living out our lives in our world, reflecting Jesus with those who need him most in our lives. Those searching for answers, those needing a Savior. So, over these next 2 weeks, here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at two of the most essential attitudes that will make the biggest difference in our lives. If we can do two things in the year ahead with our attitude, to change our attitude in two areas, it's going to make a huge difference. Not only in living in our world, but also in reflecting Jesus. Right here and now. So this morning we look at our first. And our first is found actually in a man. I'll tell you, I aspire to be more like him every single day. He's one of my heroes from the Bible. And I want to share his story with you today. In fact, we first meet him in the wilderness, in the desert, just outside the land of Canaan. God had brought his people, Israel, out of captivity in Egypt. And he was leading them back to the land that he had promised them. In fact, he promised it to a man named Abraham, who was their forefather, and said, "This is the land I've promised you." And God is now leading them back to this land. And as they get closer to this land, this whole nation is being led by God under the human leadership of a man named Moses. And Moses is getting ready to lead the people into the land. But before he does, he sends 12 men, one man from each tribe, each of the 12 tribes of Israel, into this land to check it out first. He says, I want you to come back and report back to me on what the people are like, and also the resources of the land and the strength of the cities, so that we know what we're getting ourselves into. So 40 days later, these men return. And they return with some word, and they also return with some of the things they found in the land. In fact, they're carrying grapes, clusters of grapes that are so large that it took 2 men to carry it. So things are looking pretty good. And in Numbers chapter 13, we find out what happens next when these spies come back. It says, and these spies, they told Moses, they said, "We came to the land to which you sent us, and it flows with milk and honey," which is a good thing. "And this is its fruit." And you say, "Grapes." Cool. And it's like, man, this is good news. But just as quickly as the good news comes, they have bad news to report. They continue. "However, the people who dwell in this land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there." The descendants of Anak were these giant people. It's believed that Goliath was a descendant of Anak. So these are mighty giant warriors, right? And he says, "The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negev. The Hittites and the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan." So there's all these mighty small nation states within the land. They're basically saying, you know what? This place, it's impenetrable. And it's filled with giants. and other strong warriors. And as they're telling Moses and kind of his company these things, some of those that are listening, they begin to lose their confidence. And they begin to worry a little bit when one of the spies speaks up. He's a man from the tribe of Judah, son of Jephunneh, the Kizite. He's a man named Caleb. Remember that name. Because Caleb then comes and he speaks up. And it says in verse 30, he says, but Caleb, he quiets the people before Moses. He says, wait a minute. He said, let's go up at once and occupy it, for we are able to overcome it. So he basically says, wait, don't listen to that. We can do this. Let's just go. And here what we see is we see a difference-making attitude from Caleb. And that attitude is about faith, right? He's got faith. Now, I don't know about you, but one thing I've learned about faith is that whenever we exercise faith, it's always tested, isn't it? It's kind of like praying for humility. You never pray for humility because what's going to happen? It's going to get challenged. Well, when we step out in faith, faith is always challenged. However, as we look at the rest of Caleb's story this morning, we find that his faith is unshakable. And this unshakable faith, it not only drives Caleb and his actions, but it also impacts his world and the world around him for years to come. So anyway, back to the message. Anyway, so Caleb speaks up, right? And he's got this unshakable faith in God and his unshakable faith in the promise because God said this land is going to be yours. So he's like, why not? Right? But this faith then is quickly tested because in the very next verse we see this, right? So Caleb says, no, we can overcome it. But then the men who had gone up with him, so the other spy says, no, we're not able to go up against these people. They're stronger than we are. We can't do this. And at this point now, people notice that the spies are back. So now all the people are starting to gather around. And they're starting to listen to this. And the other spies, they turn around to the crowd now. And instead of saying even that it's flowing with milk and honey, all they have to talk about the land is bad. In fact, they say, you know what it is about this land? They say, this land devours its inhabitants. It's a hard place. And besides all of that, there's giants there, these descendants of Anak, these mighty warriors. In fact, when we looked at them, we felt like grasshoppers compared to them. That's how mighty they were. And the people hear this and they start to really cry out. And they're like, there is no way we can do this, And they confront Moses and they said, Moses, how could you do this? You led us out here into this wilderness, took us from Egypt. It would have been better if we stayed as slaves in Egypt. At least we would have been safer. Or maybe, it would be better maybe if we just stay out here in the wilderness. Yeah, we'll die, but at least we don't have to suffer like going in there. We don't want to do this. And what they did, then they said, you know what, Moses, you're out. We're going to bring in new leaders who will do what we want. Maybe lead us back to Egypt in slavery. And then something happens. Caleb is joined by one of the other spies. His name is Joshua. That Joshua. You've heard of Joshua, right? In fact, he's the one who leads God's people, right, into this land. Well, Joshua then speaks up. And Numbers chapter 14 tells us that Caleb and Joshua then stand before the people, and Caleb addresses the people, but it says that Joshua and Caleb, they tear their clothes in front of the people. Okay, and what that's meaning, it's showing their passion, right? And their sincerity in what they're about to say. And it says, and they say to the congregation of the people of Israel, the land which we passed through to spy it out is exceedingly good land. It's not bad land, it's great. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into the land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only don't rebel against the Lord. Do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. You know what that means? That they're bread for us? They're nothing. They They are nothing for us to defeat. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. Sounds great. However, the people aren't impressed. In fact, it goes on to say that the people heard this and they went and picked up stones and they're about to kill Caleb and Joshua. When God intervenes, it says the glory of God then showed up in the midst of them. It's basically blinding light, and the guys all like flee. And Joshua and Caleb are spared. But through this first account about the life of Caleb, we learn that this unshakable faith makes all the difference, not only for Caleb, but it'll make all the difference in our world. Because unshakable faith, this attitude of faith that isn't shaken, is grounded. You want to know about something about the attitude of unshakable faith? It's grounded. It's immovable. It stands fully with God, even if it stands alone. That's what this attitude is. That it'll stand fully with God, even if it stands alone. You know, it would have been far easier for Caleb to just kind of go along with the rest of the spies and said, yeah, it's not great. You know, what they said. You know, and maybe give a bad report. At least maybe he'd be better accepted by others, right? But instead, Caleb stands with God. And Caleb stands with the promise God had given the people, right? And because he's done this, soon he's joined by Joshua, who also then now is able to stand up and say, yeah, that's right. You see, Caleb, he speaks up for God and his way when no one else would. He and Joshua, they stand alone before the people, even though it nearly cost them their life. You see, unshakable faith is rooted in what God says and values, no matter what anybody else is saying. Unshakable faith holds to God and his ways. And yeah, you know, when we do that in our world today, sometimes we may stand alone. Sometimes we may stand alone at work when everybody else is cutting corners to get ahead and we don't. And maybe we get passed over for things, and maybe we become the target of them ridiculing us or making fun of us. You know, maybe it stands alone. You know, we take a stand to spend time with our family. And we say, you know what, God wants us to help and spend time with our family, while all our friends are trying to pull us away from him and pull him out with us. And we say, no, we need to stand with what God's called us to do. And the question is, will we stand with God in our world today, even if we stand alone? Because standing with God isn't always popular, but standing with God is always best. In fact, we see this with Caleb, right? As his story continues, because as a result of all of this, God is fed up with the people. They've been complaining since Egypt. And God's ready to destroy them. And he says, I'm just going to destroy them. I'm just going to strike them all here. And Moses comes before God and says, God, you can't do that. Come on, all you've done and all you've promised, you can't do that. And God says, you're right, I can't do that. I'd like to, but I can't. So here's what I will do. This generation that left Egypt, every person 20 years and older, they're going to die in this wilderness. They're going to wander here until they're all dead. Well, all except two, Caleb and Joshua. They're going to be able to enter the land with the rest of the people. In fact, here's what God says to Moses, particularly about Caleb. In Numbers chapter 14, it says, but my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit, okay, a different spirit from the others, and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land into which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. So God singles out Caleb and says, oh, this guy Caleb, you know, I'm going to do this for all that generation, but not him. You know why? He's different. In fact, he follows me fully. You see, those that stand in faith, even when stand in faith with God, even if they stand alone, see life. When our faith is grounded in God, it may not always be easy, but it's always best. Now we fast forward now. It's been 45 years since God made that promise and said they're going to wander. And the people have been wandering for 40 of those 45 years. And this is where we hear Caleb again. Okay, so that generation that left Egypt is gone, except for Joshua and Caleb. Even Moses is now gone. And Joshua is the new leader of the people. So Joshua, God says, you know what? It's time. Lead the people into the land now. And they enter into this promised land. And they start as a unit, as a nation, defeating some of these large cities like Jericho and some of the other large cities. And they start to conquer this land. And after about 5 years, Joshua brings the people together. He says, all right, we've done the big work. Now, I'm going to divide the land into 12 regions, one for each tribe. And it will be your tribe's duty to clean out that region, because God says all the inhabitants have to be out, one way or another. So he divides the people up. And when he comes to Judah, okay, remember who's from the tribe of Judah? Caleb, right? And he comes to Judah, and he's getting ready to talk to them about this land and what they need to do. And Caleb stands up once again, and he comes to Joshua and he says, Joshua, you stood with unshakable faith with me. He says, I want to remind you what I did. See, unlike the other spies, I trusted God. And we pick up in Joshua 14 as Caleb continues talking to Joshua, and he says, and not only that, Moses swore to me on that day, saying, surely the land on which your foot is trodden shall be an inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God. He said, see, I've done this, and God promised this. I'm just reminding you of it. And now, behold, the Lord has kept me alive, just as he said, these 45 years since the time that the Lord spoke the word to Moses, while Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, I am this day 85 years old. Okay, so picture Caleb here, 85 years old. Okay, that's getting up there, isn't it? But here's what Caleb says. He says, I'm 85 years old. And then he goes on, he says, I'm still as strong today as I was in the day that Moses sent me. My strength now is as my strength was then, for war and for going to war and coming. That's a warrior, isn't it? So now, give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard that day how the Anakim were there with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out, just as the Lord said. This is massive here. Caleb is basically saying to God, to Joshua, hey, you know what? Yeah, I may be old right now, but God is faithful. I trust him. So the toughest land, this hill country with the giants and the greatest fortified cities, give me and my clan that land. We'll take it. Because God is with us. And he says, I may be old, but I'm just as strong now as I was then. Now, at 85 years old, I doubt he's physically as strong. But you know what he's referring to? My faith is just as strong as it was when I came back and stood alone with God. And my faith for God, because that's what he says. He says, because if God is with me, he'll give it to us. So he's talking about his faith, right? This is a warrior. This is a faith warrior, isn't it? And in this statement to Joshua, we find that unshakable faith that makes all the difference, not only for Caleb, but for us. It's not only because it's grounded, but it's also confident. See, unshakable faith is confident that God can do anything, even the seemingly impossible. What Caleb's asking to do is almost impossible. It's like a suicide mission. The odds are so far stacked against him and his clan, his small group of men, that there's pretty much no chance. But Caleb trusts in God's promise and his power to work. Doesn't matter his age, doesn't matter the size of the enemy or the strength of their cities. If God said it, he would do it. Period. Wouldn't you love that kind of confidence? I know I was. You know? And the question is, do we believe God can do anything? Do we truly believe that? Or do we just kind of say, yeah, God can do anything, but I don't know? Do we truly believe that God can do anything? Do we trust that God can use us despite our past or despite our failures, despite our weaknesses? Do we trust that God can give us all that we need to accomplish what he calls us to do? Do we trust that God can overcome all obstacles, remove what might stand before us, give us favor with others in sharing Jesus where there is no favor? You see, God can do anything. There is nothing, not us, not others, or any obstacle that stands against, that can possibly stand against us, that is bigger than he is. You see, confidence isn't about our ability, but God's. Say that again. Confidence isn't about our ability, it's about God's. Unshakable faith trusts that God can, and then it simply follows as God leads. In standing up for him, in sharing Jesus with others, in loving others as God loves us. When we walk in unshakable faith, you know what happens? We get to see God do the seemingly impossible right before our eyes. Have you ever seen God do the seemingly impossible right in front of your eyes? I've seen God heal people that had no hope. I've seen God change people's lives who you thought would never change. I've seen God supply needs out of the weirdest ways possible. And you know why that is? Because God can do the impossible, the seemingly impossible. Nothing's impossible for him. Are we confident in that? In fact, that's what Caleb experiences as the story continues. He says, yeah, I'm going to do this. Well, anyway, Caleb and his clan, they walk in this. They're going to walk confidently because Joshua says, all right, Caleb, have at it. So Caleb leads his clan, his group. And they defeat many of the giants in these cities of the hill country. And now Caleb comes to one last stronghold. It's the city of Kiriath Sefer. And it's here, this last stronghold, that Caleb issues a challenge. It's in Joshua chapter 14. It says, and Caleb says to his men, he says, you know, whoever strikes Kiriath Sefer and captures it, to him I will give Aksa, my daughter, as wife. So he's basically saying, you know what? Who's going to be bold in their faith? Who's going to really put your money where your mouth is? You know what? I'll give you a little incentive. Here's my daughter. She must be beautiful. He's giving her and saying, I'll give you permission to marry my daughter. And verse 17 says, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, the brother of Caleb, captured it. And he gave Aksa, his daughter, as wife. So Caleb's nephew, Othniel, leads the victory, and God gives them over the city, and he gets the girl. Isn't that cool? Now, that'd be awesome if that's the end of the story. If I was an end of a movie, you'd be like, wow, that's amazing. But Caleb's story isn't done yet. Like I said, this is somebody with unshakable faith. So his story doesn't end there. You see, after this, again, God had commanded the Israelites. He says, when you go into this land I'm going to give you, you need to defeat all the people of the land. You can't leave any of them. And although Caleb was successful with this, and he was obedient, many of the people failed at this. Many of God's people failed, and they left some of the inhabitants in the land. And as years went by, these inhabitants, these non-Israelites, they begin to get into the Israel society, and they began to negatively influence God's people. In particular, they start to lead God's people away from him. And they start to worship other gods and start to do evil in God's sight. And what happens after this then is Israel enters this vicious cycle. And here's the cycle. They would be following God for a while, but eventually they'd kind of let their guard down and they'd start to drift away. They'd start to fall away from God. And that would lead to them then worshiping other gods and doing all kinds of evil in God's sight. So God would look at that and he would say, this isn't going to happen. So he would send oppressors to them. He'd send other nations in to invade them and to oppress them and to wake them up. And as a result of that, the people then would cry out to God and they'd say, we're sorry, God, save us. So God would send a righteous warrior to rescue them, leading them back to him. And there would be peace in the land. But eventually that rescuer would die. And after he would die, the people would start to slough off again, and they would drift away, start to worship other gods, and God then would send another, and the whole cycle would repeat itself. And this is what the book of Judges is all about. So these rescuers, or they're called judges, right? They were devout in faith. They were God's mighty warriors. Anyway, at the beginning of this period of the Judges, in fact, the very first time this happens, okay, the people are beginning to fall away, right? And they began worshiping other gods. So God sends in an invading army, the Mesopotamians, and they come in and they enslave God's people. And after 8 years of being slaves again, the people cry out to God and they say, God, we're sorry, help us. And that's when this happens. Judges chapter 3, it says, but when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel, who saved them. Look at that next person. Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel, and he went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed against this Cushan-Rishathaim. And then it goes on to say, and as a result, the land had rest for 40 years. Othniel, the same guy who answered his uncle's call to have unshakable faith, to trust God in conquering the land of promise, now demonstrates unshakable faith himself. You see, this kind of faith makes all the difference in our world, not only because it's grounded and it's confident, but also because it's inspirational. Unshakable faith provides an example for other people to follow. This is Caleb's legacy. Not only that he was the guy who spearheaded all of the people of Israel going into the land and taking the hill country and taking on all of these things for God's power to work. Not only did he do all of that, but then people were watching him. And they went and did the same. And it rescued God's people again. Again, Othniel, he watched Caleb. He was watching as Caleb followed God and as he stood in the promised victory, as Caleb relied on God's strength in battle. Othniel had an example to follow in Caleb, so that when he was called, he himself was ready to follow with unshakable faith. You see, our unshakable faith in God should be seen and witnessed by others. It should be influencing others. Do you long to inspire this kind of faith in others? Do you long to, if you're a parent, do you long to see that in your kids? Do you long to see that in the people that God's brought into your life? To see that kind of faith just come alive in them? Then here's what we need to do. We need to let others see God shaping our faith. Let others see God growing us. Because being strong, being perfect, always having all the answers to everything, that's not nearly as inspiring to others as them being able to watch our faith in action. As it grows, as God grows it to be more unshakable. As it becomes more grounded in God, more confident in His power. Our faith growing more unshakable will inspire others in growing their faith. So this is our first game-changing attitude as we enter the year. You want to face this new year differently? I mean, do you want to really see God at work and be an influence in that way? Put on faith in God that cannot be shaken by anything or anyone. You know, over the next several days, over the next several weeks or months, we're all going to face challenges that we can't control. We're going to face situations that come to us that seem overwhelming. We may do it the minute we walk out the door today. We're going to face these kinds of things where faith will be required. And only faith that's unshakable will not only survive, but it'll thrive. Faith that's grounded fully in God, even if it stands alone, that faith will endure. Faith whose confidence is in God, who alone can do the impossible, that kind of faith will stand out. Faith that inspires others in faith will keep growing, not only in us, but in those that we influence. Unshakable faith in an ever-changing, unstable world will stand out, and it'll draw others to the source of our faith, our unchanging, unshakable God. So be encouraged by this. Be encouraged by Caleb, man. He's my hero. With amazing, unshakable faith. Let's pray.